That fake metal doesn't fool me, old man. The security officer's voice cut through the Memorial Day morning like a blade. Marcus Webb, 30 years old, clipboard in hand, didn't even glance at the invitation letter Harold Morrison held with weathered fingers. Harold stood quietly at the Arlington Cemetery gates, the morning sun catching the glass of the shadow box he carried. Inside, 2 medals rested on faded navy blue felt, his Navy Cross from Vietnam, and beside it, his son Michael's Bronze Star from Afghanistan. The son who would never come home. The son whose last radio transmission was, "Tell Dad I kept the promise." But Webb saw only an old man with a walking cane, silver hair, and a dress uniform that had seen better decades. He saw what he thought was stolen valor in a scratched glass case. "Sir, you're not on any guest list," Webb continued, his finger pointing directly at the Navy Cross. "Anyone can buy these online. This isn't a costume party." Harold recoiled slightly, clutching the case against his chest. More guards approached. Webb's voice got louder. "Security! We got a stolen valor situation here." Heads turned. Phones came out. Harold's face flushed with embarrassment. He had come to honor the fallen. Instead, he was being accused of dishonoring them. Webb reached for the medal case. "Hand it over, old man." That's when Harold noticed her. A woman in navy dress blues standing near the ceremonial platform, Admiral's stripes gleaming on her shoulders, watching from 50 yards away. She had been watching the entire time. Harold stayed where he was, just outside the black wrought iron gates. The sun climbed slowly behind him, casting long shadows across the pristine white headstones. His posture didn't falter, even with the ache in his leg. Even as people in dress uniforms walked past him without a glance. A few guests showed their credentials and were waved through. 1 or 2 glanced his way, a flicker of confusion, maybe pity, but no one stopped. A woman with a professional camera adjusted her lens and turned deliberately in another direction. Inside, rows of white chairs filled quickly with Gold Star families and military dignitaries. Flags lined the central path leading to the ceremonial platform. A Marine honor guard rehearsed their movements in perfect silence. Harold looked down at the invitation tucked in his breast pocket. It wasn't laminated. It wasn't digital. Just a folded piece of official letterhead with Admiral Rebecca Sterling's signature, requesting his presence as a guest of honor at the Memorial Day ceremony. He offered it again to the same guard. Webb didn't even touch it. "Sir, that could be forged. Documents like this get faked all the time." "I came to honor my son," Harold said softly. "Name of the deceased? Michael Anthony Morrison, Section 60, Row 15. Webb tapped at his tablet with growing impatience. "Relation to deceased? Father. He was killed 4 years ago today. Afghanistan." Webb looked up again, this time with a mix of discomfort and practiced indifference. "I'm sorry for your loss, sir, but without proper clearance on our security list, we simply cannot make exceptions." Harold nodded once. "I understand." He stepped back again and waited. The metal case wasn't new. The brass corners were tarnished. The velvet inside had faded from deep navy to something closer to gray. But the metals themselves gleamed in the morning light, polished to perfection, as they had been every Memorial Day for the past 4 years. His Navy Cross bore the weight of a night in 1971 when torpedo fragments tore through the USS Caldwell's engine room. 7 sailors trapped below deck, water rising fast, emergency lights flickering. He had gone back 3 times. The Bronze Star belonged to Michael. Posthumous, awarded for actions during a Taliban ambush outside Kandahar. 14 Marines lived because Michael Morrison had drawn enemy fire away from their position. The same position where he died. A gust of wind swept across the grounds, rattling the ceremonial flags. The edge of Harold's coat lifted, revealing the worn metal grip of his walking cane. He pressed the fabric down gently, maintaining the military bearing that 60 years of service had burned into his bones. One of the guards near the gate leaned toward a colleague and whispered something under his breath. The other laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that carries just far enough to wound. Harold heard it. He didn't turn. Instead, He looked through the bars again, through the crowd already assembling for the wreath-laying ceremony, toward the platform where they would read the names of the fallen. He had been here before, not for this ceremony, but for the smaller ones, the services where families couldn't make the journey, the memorials for soldiers who died alone and far from home, just headstones and half-empty chairs and the quiet dignity of final honors. He wasn't here for pageantry. He was here because he remembered. And because somewhere in Section 60, beneath a simple white cross, lay the son who had radioed his last words to a distant command post. "Don't let them bury me alone." Harold had kept that promise for 4 years running. A group of younger security personnel passed by, sharing coffee from paper cups and trading weekend plans. One of them noticed Harold still standing there and paused mid-conversation. "Hey, who let Grandpa crash the VIP section?" The others chuckled, not malicious, but careless in the way that youth often is. The one who spoke looked closer and pointed at the medal case in Harold's weathered hands. "What is that thing? Some kind of military memorabilia?" Harold didn't answer. He raised one hand to adjust his collar, then folded both hands in front of him, one gripping his walking cane, the other holding the case containing his son's final honor, and stared forward with the patience of a man who had learned to endure. Still, like a statue too dignified to defend itself against ignorance, the sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows through the iron gates. Inside, the service had officially begun. Harold could hear the distant notes of the national anthem carried on the morning breeze, the kind of sound that makes you straighten your spine whether anyone's watching or not. He didn't move. Not when the honor guard presented arms. Not when the first rifle volley cracked across the pristine grounds. And not when the boys returned. The same group of young guards wandered back toward the entrance, restless from standing in formation, trading glances and checking their phones. One of them carried a program from the ceremony, glossy paper folded neatly. Another scrolled through social media, casual, disconnected. They slowed when they saw Harold still standing there, still waiting, still silent. "Man," one of them muttered. "He hasn't moved in like 2 hours. That's either dedication or someone should check if he's breathing." The others laughed again. Webb stepped closer, his boots scraping against the gravel with deliberate authority. He pointed at the medal case again. "Those medals? You get those from a military surplus store?" Harold didn't respond. "They look awfully shiny for Vietnam-era gear," Webb said, leaning in with practiced skepticism. "Most of the real ones I've seen are beaten up. Tarnished, these look like they came off a costume rack." Another round of soft laughter from the assembled guards. Not cruel, but careless, and somehow that made it worse. Webb reached out, just 2 fingers testing, and tapped the glass case like it was a museum display he was examining for authenticity. The case shifted slightly in Harold's hands. Harold's grip tightened instinctively. Not fast, not defensive, just enough to steady the medals that meant more to him than his own life. Then he looked Webb directly in the eyes, not with anger, not with sadness. Just with the steady gaze of a man who had seen real combat and real loss and real honor. Webb's confident smirk faded like morning mist. He stepped back without another word. No one else spoke. No one intervened. A nearby supervisor glanced over, witnessed the entire exchange, and turned back to his clipboard as if nothing had happened. Across the field, the ceremony continued in solemn pageantry. A folded flag was being passed from one white-gloved hand to another. Dignified words were spoken into microphones that carried them across the hallowed ground. Cameras clicked with respectful discretion. Government officials nodded at appropriate moments. Harold remained at the gate, unacknowledged, uninvited, invisible. A few minutes later, the group of guards drifted away toward other duties. One of them muttered something about old-timers living in the past. Another made a joke about costume parties. Harold waited until they were gone. Then he sat down slowly on a low stone bench, positioned near the cemetery wall, his walking cane making a soft tap against the concrete. He placed the medal case beside him with the care reserved for sacred objects. He exhaled, a long, tired breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades, and then reached into his coat pocket with fingers that trembled slightly from age and emotion. He pulled out a small, carefully folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it with infinite care, pressing out the creases like it was a document of national importance, because to him, it was. The paper was worn at the edges from countless readings. The ink had faded from black to something closer to gray. But the words were still clear, written in the steady handwriting of a young man preparing for the worst. Dad, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. Don't blame yourself. Don't blame the Corps. I knew the risks when I signed up, just like you did. I want you to remember what you taught me when I was a kid. Honor isn't in the medal you wear. It's in the promise you keep. I kept mine. Now I need you to keep yours. Visit Section 60 every Memorial Day. Tell them I wasn't alone. Tell them my father was a Navy Cross recipient who taught me that some things are worth dying for. I love you, Dad. Michael. Harold stared at the letter until the words blurred. Then he folded it once, twice, and placed it gently back against his heart. No cameras captured that moment. No one applauded. No one even noticed the quiet dignity of a father's grief. Except one person. Admiral Rebecca Sterling, standing near the ceremonial platform in her dress blue uniform, had been observing the scene at the gates from the moment Harold arrived. Her uniform was immaculate, ribbons and medals arranged in perfect order on her chest. She hadn't approached. She hadn't intervened. She had simply watched and remembered. Now she turned from the ceremony and walked with measured purpose toward the command tent. Harold remained seated on the stone bench, not slumped in defeat, not broken by the morning's humiliation, just still. The letter rested in his breast pocket now, close to his heart, where it had lived for 4 years. He kept one hand pressed over it, flesh and bone, weathered by time but steady with purpose, as if protecting something infinitely precious. The sounds of the Memorial Day ceremony floated across the manicured grounds. Muffled eulogies honoring the fallen, ceremonial commands barked with military precision, the sharp echo of polished boots moving in synchronized formation. But here, outside the gates, there was only the whisper of wind through the trees, and the weight of memory. Harold shifted slightly on the stone bench, feeling the familiar ache in his leg where shrapnel had found its mark decades ago. He didn't grimace. He didn't complain. Instead, he reached down and straightened his pant leg with military precision. He wiped a speck of dust from his walking cane. Then he retrieved the medal case and stood with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned that dignity was a choice, not a circumstance. Slowly, purposefully, back to attention. No one ordered him to stand. No one was watching. But he stood as if someone was. As if Michael might be looking down from whatever place heroes go when their watch is ended. As if the 7 sailors he had pulled from that flooding destroyer compartment in 1971 could still see the man who had never left anyone behind. He remembered the way Michael's voice had sounded during their last phone call, not afraid but absolutely certain of his purpose. I'm doing what you taught me, Dad. What's that, son? Making sure nobody dies alone. Those were the last words his son had spoken to him. Harold had carried them every day since. He turned now, facing the memorial platform in the distance, where the ceremony was reaching its climax. His eyes didn't water. They remained fixed and clear, focused on the future rather than dwelling on the past. The morning breeze caught the hem of his coat again. This time he let it flow freely. And then, with no audience, no music, no official sanction, he raised his right hand in salute. It wasn't the crisp, textbook motion of his youth. His arm moved slowly, carefully, trembling slightly with the weight of years but perfect in its intention and meaning. A salute not to the ceremony taking place beyond the gates, but to a promise, to a memory, to a son who had kept his word until the very end. At that exact moment, across the field, Admiral Rebecca Sterling stepped into the white command tent where the ceremony director was reviewing the final protocols for the wreath-laying. Her boots were polished to mirror brightness. Her posture carried the authority of 3 decades in uniform, but her voice was quiet, almost urgent, when she interrupted the proceedings. "Sir," she said, careful not to disrupt the solemn atmosphere, "there's someone at the gates, someone I think you need to see immediately." The ceremony director looked up from his detailed notes, surprised by the interruption. "Ma'am?" Admiral Sterling's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Chief Petty Officer Harold Morrison, Navy Cross recipient. He's being denied entry by our security team." There was a pause that seemed to stretch across decades. Then recognition dawned like sunrise. The director's expression changed completely. Not the look of an officer receiving routine information, but of a man remembering something he'd carried in his heart for 50 years. "Harold Morrison," he whispered. "USS Caldwell." Admiral Sterling nodded. "My father's ship." She didn't wait for further discussion or bureaucratic protocol. She handed her ceremonial folder to a junior aide, removed her white dress gloves with purposeful efficiency, and stepped out of the command tent with the kind of quiet determination that comes from absolute moral clarity. The honor guard noticed the interruption and paused their formation. The speakers at the podium hesitated, unsure why the ranking officer was suddenly departing from the carefully scripted ceremony. Sterling crossed the main ceremonial aisle, not toward the microphones, not toward the distinguished guests, but away from the heart of the official proceedings. She walked with measured urgency across the perfectly manicured grass, past the rows of white headstones directly toward the cemetery gates, toward Harold Morrison. The crowd began to murmur and turn, following her movement with growing curiosity. Some guests stood for a better view. Photographers adjusted their lenses and camera angles. No one understood why the highest-ranking officer present was abandoning her central role in the middle of the most important Memorial Day ceremony of the year, until they witnessed what happened next. Admiral Sterling stopped just 3 feet from Harold, close enough to see the deep lines that 60 years of service and 4 years of grief had etched into his weathered face. She didn't salute immediately. She looked first, fully, completely, taking in every detail of the man before her, the man with the walking cane and the faded uniform, the man whose dress blues were pressed to perfection despite being decades out of regulation, the man who had stood without invitation, without recognition, without complaint for over 2 hours in the morning sun. Then, without a word, Admiral Sterling extended her hand, not in command, not for show, not for the cameras, but in the kind of reverence reserved for the rarest form of human courage. "Chief Petty Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent grounds. "I've been waiting my entire career to meet you." Harold blinked, confusion and hope warring in his weathered features. "Ma'am?" Sterling's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. "My father made me promise something when I graduated from the Naval Academy. He said if I ever encountered Harold Morrison anywhere in my chain of command, I had a debt to pay." Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there's been some mistake." Admiral Sterling gestured to a young sailor standing nearby, who immediately stepped forward carrying a memorial wreath of red, white, and blue flowers. USS Caldwell, South China Sea, March 15, 1971. Engine room flooded after a torpedo strike. 7 men trapped below deck with rising water and failing power. Harold's breath caught in his throat. "You went back 3 times, Chief Morrison. 3 times into that flooding compartment while the ship was listing and taking on water." She paused, letting the weight of memory settle between them. "My father was Lieutenant Commander David Sterling, navigation officer. He was the 7th man you pulled out." The metal case trembled in Harold's hands. "He lived because of you, Chief. Lived to see me graduate high school. Lived to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. Lived to hold his granddaughter for the first time." Sterling's voice grew stronger, carrying across the grounds to the assembled crowd. "And I'm standing here wearing these Admiral's stripes because Harold Morrison decided that no sailor dies alone on his watch." Harold looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time. Behind them, the entire Memorial Day assembly had turned to witness the exchange. Hundreds of people, Gold Star families, military officials, veterans in wheelchairs, young soldiers in dress uniform, all standing in absolute silence. No one spoke. No one moved. And when Harold took his first step toward the ceremonial platform, Admiral Sterling positioned herself beside him, not leading, not following, but walking shoulder to shoulder in the kind of partnership that transcends rank and protocol. Together they walked, through the gates that had been barred to him, across the field where he had been denied entry, toward the memorial platform where his presence had been questioned and his service had been doubted. The ceremony band remained silent. The press corps lowered their cameras out of respect. The only sound was the whisper of shifting uniforms and the quiet rhythm of footsteps on hallowed ground as veterans throughout the crowd, young and old, active duty and retired, snapped to attention on both sides of their impromptu procession. Some raised their hands in salute, others simply placed their hands over their hearts. Harold carried his son's memory and his own service record like he had carried his oath of enlistment 60 years earlier. Not for recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. Admiral Sterling leaned close and said, just loud enough for Harold to hear, "Your son, Michael. I read his file before today's ceremony. 14 Marines came home because of what he did in Afghanistan." Harold's voice was thick with emotion. "He learned it from his old man, ma'am." "I can see that," Sterling replied. And in that moment, surrounded by the honored dead and the living witnesses to sacrifice, the silence became something sacred. The final 100 yards to the memorial platform seemed to stretch across eternity and pass in an instant simultaneously. Harold walked with measured steps, the metal case steady in his weathered hands, despite the tremor of emotion running through his entire body. The morning breeze had softened to barely a whisper. The sun, now approaching its zenith, cast everything in golden light that seemed to sanctify the moment. He no longer heard the murmurs of the crowd, no longer noticed the clicking of cameras or the rustle of programs or the gleam of brass buttons catching sunlight like scattered stars. All his attention was focused on the memorial platform ahead, the wreath stand waiting beneath a canopy of flags, the marble pedestal where the names of the fallen were inscribed in letters that would outlast the memories of those who carved them. And beside him, Admiral Sterling matched his pace exactly, neither hurrying him forward nor holding him back, simply sharing the weight of the moment with the quiet dignity that true leadership requires. Halfway through their procession, Harold noticed something that stopped his heart for just a moment. The same young security guards who had questioned his presence earlier, now standing at rigid attention along the pathway. Not because they had been ordered to, not because protocol demanded it, but because they had finally understood what they were witnessing. Each of them stood with perfect military bearing, eyes forward, shoulders back, rendering the kind of respect that comes not from regulation, but from recognition. And as Harold passed directly in front of Marcus Webb, the guard who had called his medals fake and his presence unauthorized, Webb took one step forward and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the silent grounds. "Sir, Chief Morrison, I was wrong. I apologize." Harold didn't break stride, but he turned his head just enough to meet Webb's eyes and nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey forgiveness, understanding, and the kind of grace that comes only from having survived real trials. And in that single moment, the apology carried more moral weight than all the accusations that had preceded it. They reached the memorial platform where hundreds of distinguished guests and Gold Star families had been waiting in respectful silence. Admiral Sterling gestured toward the wreath stand with its arrangement of red, white, and blue flowers. "Chief Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "would you do us the honor of placing today's memorial wreath?" Harold looked at the wreath, then at the marble pedestal where so many names were carved, then back at Admiral Sterling. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's appropriate. This ceremony, these people, they deserve better than—" "Chief," Sterling interrupted gently but firmly, "there is no one here more qualified to honor our fallen than a man who has spent 4 years keeping a promise to his son." Harold stepped forward, carefully set his medal case on a small table beside the platform, and lifted the memorial wreath with both hands. The flowers were heavier than he had expected, dense with symbolism and soaked with the morning dew that made them glisten like tears. He placed the wreath on the marble pedestal with infinite care. Then he stepped back 3 paces and rendered the most perfect salute of his entire military career. No applause followed, no anthem played, just absolute stillness that felt like prayer. And then, like a wave spreading across calm water, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the assembled crowd. Veterans scattered among the civilian guests began to stand slowly, some in full-dress uniform, others in simple civilian clothes marked only by service pins and the unmistakable bearing that military service leaves on a person forever. Some raised their hands in salute, others removed their hats and held them over their hearts. An elderly woman wearing a Gold Star mother pin struggled to her feet without assistance, her legs shaking with age and emotion. A young Marine in a wheelchair rolled himself forward slightly and whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "Welcome home, Chief." A Navy SEAL, still wearing his Special Operations insignia, snapped to attention and held his salute until Harold had completed his own. Harold felt tears gathering at the corners of his eyes, not from sadness, but because he hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined that his quiet pilgrimage to honor his son would become something larger than himself. The ceremony concluded with the traditional playing of taps. The lone bugler stood on a small rise overlooking the memorial, and the haunting notes rolled across the grounds like a benediction, each phrase sinking deep into the hearts of everyone present. When the final note faded into silence, Admiral Sterling turned to Harold with an expression of profound respect. "I know you didn't come here seeking recognition, Chief," she said quietly. Harold picked up his medal case and nodded. "I came to keep a promise to my son." "I understand," Sterling replied. "But some promises create ripples that extend far beyond their original purpose." 2 hours later, as the last chairs were being folded and the final guests were departing, a small group remained gathered around Section 60, where the individual headstones of the fallen stretched in perfect rows beneath the afternoon sun. They stood in a circle around a newly placed bronze marker at the base of a young oak tree that had been planted 4 years earlier. The marker read simply, "In memory of Michael Anthony Morrison and the crew of USS Caldwell, because honor is not given, it is carried from one generation to the next." No statue accompanied it. No eternal flame burned beside it. Just truth, carved in bronze and planted in the earth where it would remain long after everyone present had joined the ranks of those they had come to honor. Harold stood quietly beside the tree, his weathered fingers tracing the bark with the gentleness of a father's touch. Then, without ceremony or announcement, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Michael's letter one final time. He knelt slowly beside the newly placed marker, his old knees protesting the movement, and placed the letter carefully in the soft earth at the base of the oak tree, a gesture that no one had requested, a ritual that no protocol had prescribed, but an act that somehow felt more appropriate than any words that might have been spoken. Admiral Sterling stepped beside him as he struggled back to his feet. "They'll come here," Harold said, looking at the bronze marker. "Other families, other fathers who've lost sons." Sterling nodded with certainty. "They're already coming, Chief. Word spreads quickly in our community." Harold turned to leave, declining offers of escort or assistance, choosing instead to walk the same path he had taken for 4 years, alone, unhurried, carrying his burden and his purpose with equal grace. This time, however, when people encountered him on the pathway, they didn't stare with confusion or pity. They stood, because some uniforms fade with time and washing, but some men, and the principles they represent, never do. If you typed respect earlier, thank you. Subscribe for more stories where dignity triumphs over authority. Support our mission through Buy Me a Coffee. Link in the first pinned comment. Until next time, remember, honor never fades.